Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Peter MacLeod. I'm the editor of Logistics Business magazine, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the latest webinar from Logistics Business, brought to you today by Kinaxis. Entitled Supply Chain Management, Striking a Balance Between Speed and Accuracy, today I'm talking with Matt Spooner, industry thought leader at Kinaxis, about how, with the right tools and expertise, businesses can optimize both supply chain agility and accuracy. Matt, welcome to this webinar and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm really pleased to be joining.
I have to say my attention was grabbed by the pre-event blurb suggesting that over the next 45 minutes or so, you'll be bringing together the seemingly disparate worlds of cycling and supply chain management. But before we get into the meat of this, this is for all of our viewers today. Thank you for joining us. And please note that we want to encourage interactivity. And to this end, we're going to urge all of you to take advantage of this opportunity to tap into Matt's considerable knowledge and experience of the industry by popping a question into Zoom's live Q&A function, which on my screen appears on the tab along the bottom. And I'll be looking through these as the conversation progresses and putting as many as possible to Matt, as many of these questions as possible to Matt. So please do take this opportunity to put some questions in there. So today, Matt, we're going to be talking about balancing supply chain accuracy and agility. And I'm compelled to ask you, what on earth does this have in common with cycling?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Peter. And, it wasn't a normal cycling event that I was doing. So I was taking part in the Transcontinental Race, which is the definitive self-supported cycle race across Europe. It's a really hard bike race that's very simple in its design, but complex in its execution. So you have to rely on factors such as self-reliance, logistics, navigation, how you cope with it physically. And this is really a race where the strongest excel and redefine what we think is possible. It's a single stage race where the clock never stops and the riders have to plan, research, navigate their own courses, choose whenever they want to rest. We can only take what we can carry and only consume what we can find. However, there are also some mandatory control points and some mandatory routes where we have to follow a set course. So to give you some idea about the scale of the race, and which is how I'll come back to answering the question. Overall, the race is about 4,027 kilometers, which is 2,500 miles. It includes 48,000 meters of climbing, which is about 157,000 feet of climbing. I completed the race in 2 weeks, actually in 13 days, which is 291 kilometers a day or 180 miles a day, with 3,500 meters of climbing or nearly 12,000 feet of climbing every day. So this is not just a normal cycle race. Now, how does this relate to supply chain and supply chain planning? Well, there's, going into this, where you're sort of planning to do such a large event, the quality of the plan is critical. Getting the best plan possible in terms of the route that I'm going to follow, where I'm going to stop, how I'm going to eat, how I'm going to feed myself, how I'm going to rest. Getting all those elements of the plan down correctly is absolutely critical. But you can't plan for every single eventuality. Things will happen that you just are not prepared for. And you actually have to be agile and have the ability to replan and to respond to events as they really happen. And this is very similar to what really happens within a supply chain and how we operate a supply chain. It's actually the quality of the plan and the agility to respond. I'm actually just going to share my screen just now. I'll just show you a couple of the things from the cycling race and actually give you some examples about where planning was absolutely critical.
Yeah, I get what you're saying there. So, you mentioned some of the sort of the fixed points, and that I suppose in supply chain means ports. You mentioned some of the unplanned events. So I guess in supply chain that means volcanoes and Suez Canal blockages. What are the other parallels there?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that actually as we go through this, but you've got the unplanned events, that you just described, which like mechanical breakdowns. Those happen when you're cycling, and actually that happened to me on a mountain in Greece, where I was actually about 2,000 meters up a mountain. I was 25 kilometers away from the nearest village, and I broke a critical part of my bike. I broke the rear derailleur. At that point that I thought that my race was over, but actually what I was looking at there is actually to start to sit back and think about it. So what were the different actions that I could do that would allow me? Oh, and I should have mentioned this happened at about coming up to midnight as well. So it was really in the middle of the night. So what could I do in that eventuality? I had a bike which wasn't working, but at that point I had 2 days in hand, because there's a minimum or maximum time limit, and I had to get to the next checkpoint. But I was actually doing really well, and I had 2 days of reserve, and I was quite near to the next checkpoint. So you start looking at those. What are those actions that you can do? So the first thing was actually to be able to get my bike off the mountain and go and push my bike for 25 kilometers. Yeah, it took me about 4 hours to do that. Then getting to a little village at actually at 2 o'clock in the morning. Luckily, it was Greece, so 2 o'clock in the morning, the whole village is in full party mode. There was a wedding in one of the 2 restaurants, and the other restaurant they were clearing up. So I went to the restaurant where they were clearing up, and they helped me. They introduced me to a taxi driver, and we arranged that he would go and take me in a taxi the next day to the nearest big town, which was actually about 100 kilometers away, in order where there was a bike shop, so I could get there at 8 o'clock in the morning, get my bike repaired, and then I had to actually ride back to the point where to the village and restart my race. And I lost a day because of that, because I had 2 days in hand, I was actually able to continue. So that's an example about the type of events that I was having it on a bike race. And I think you can see that these are very similar to the type of events that we have in the supply chain. You can have a supplier who lets you down. You can have a vehicle that breaks down. You can have a factory that burns down. There are all sorts of events, and it's actually about the ability to deal with those events and actually put mitigation strategies in place. But here's what I'm showing on my screen is the route that I took, and you can see that I started in Belgium and rode 4,027 kilometers throughout Europe. Now, the reason I put this in to show you is that this was critical to my planning. In fact, there were 4 phases that I had. The first phase was actually about what was the strategy. And my strategy was to be able to ride to Greece within the 15-day cutoff, which is the maximum time that was allowed. That was my first bit of the strategy. The second bit of my strategy was that I was going to try and sleep every night for at least 6 hours. The third element of my strategy was that I would sit down and have 3 meals a day, have a proper breakfast, proper lunch, proper dinner. And those were like the fundamental points of my strategy. And I think that's really important when we consider supply chain. We actually need to have really clear objectives. We should have objectives like, we will always deliver to these customers with 100% accuracy, or we will always deliver these high profitability products with 100% accuracy. That will be the objective. We then say, well, actually, of these high value products, we will hold a certain amount of inventory at certain inventory holding locations. So in order for us to guarantee that, that is actually part of that, that strategy. The next part comes in, which is actually creating the plan. And in my case, creating a cycling route was actually to be able to, identify what was my best route, going through all of the 4 checkpoints, and the 4 checkpoints are shown on this map, identifying how long it was going to take me to reach each of those checkpoints, making sure that the roads that I was riding on were the most suitable roads, so that I was riding on appropriate roads. I was riding on roads which would be safe, but also would be fast enough to ride on. And I think that's also the same in the supply chain. We need to have a plan. We need to have a forecast for our products. We need to have, our logistics providers all set up. We need to have the factories all primed to be able to achieve that plan and be able to create that plan. And then you've got the next part of it, which I describe as the tactics. The tactics would be, in the cycling race, do I take, I might, on my plan, I might have several scenarios planned. I might have 2 or 3 different routes that I plan to cope with different conditions. So one example of this was, I had a route, if you look at the Balkans on this map, I had a route which actually went through Bosnia and went through Zagreb and Sarajevo, which was more direct. But I was concerned that it would be very hot on that route. Or I had another route plan which went through Croatia down by the coast. So I actually had 2 different scenarios planned. And the tactic was, when I got to Slovenia and I had to make that decision, which of my 2 scenarios do I follow, was I be able to identify which of those correct, so which of those scenarios would I make a decision. So I was actually looking at the weather forecast, and I saw that the weather forecast in Bosnia was actually looking pretty bad. There was going to be lots of rain, and there was a much better weather forecast going through Croatia. So therefore, I'm going to choose a scenario that goes through Croatia. We have and there were multiple different. I probably had 20 or 30 different scenarios. There are that's exactly the same as we have when we're planning the supply chain. We've got these scenarios. What's the tactics? What are the decision-making criteria that will allow us to choose the correct scenario?
And you're making these sort of decisions on the fly, effectively, which again is sort of very real world.
Absolutely, and that's why you need to have a framework. If you don't have a decision-making framework, what tends to happen is you prevaricate and you think, oh, I'm going to take a long time to make that. I'm going to take a long time to make that decision. Or you don't have a proper decision-making framework and therefore you make the wrong decision. So yes, the tool might have accurately planned 2 different scenarios, but you actually need the heuristics, and you need the planner who has the skills and that decision-making framework to make that decision. And that actually leads me into another thing. I was thinking about this a lot when I was riding. When you've just woken up, you've just had breakfast, your ability to make complex decisions is actually pretty good. But when you're really tired, you're coming up to the end of the day, you've ridden 280 kilometers, you've experienced really hot weather, your ability to make decisions is really compromised. And so what you want to do is to minimize those decisions to very simple yes/no decisions when you're tired, whereas you can make complex decisions when you're alert. In the supply chain, it's exactly the same. When we've been going through periods of really high disruption, as we were through through COVID, and actually in all the supply chain disruptions last year, our ability as organizations to make complex decisions actually becomes really limited because we are exhausted as organizations. And we've seen that with the number of people who have just burnt out. And we need to simplify those decisions. We need the tools to help us make those decisions, make the best decision that we can. It might not be the optimum decision, but hopefully it's a good enough decision that's going to get us to our end goal. And so we need to make very simple decisions. Whereas maybe when things are a little bit more stable, or maybe we're at the beginning of the quarter, we've had a good last quarter, we can make more complex decisions, and therefore we can have different decision-making criteria. And I think that's really important to say that there's this temporal element, there's this element of exhaustion about how do we make these decisions, because it's not going to be the same every time.
Yeah, sure. I can relate to that, Matt. I did a similar thing across Tanzania many years ago. I would say it was kind of, I wouldn't be surprised to say it was certainly less digital than your journey would have been. Whereas I was relying on maps and local knowledge and looking up at the sky. I imagine there's probably data was playing a little bit more a part in your journey, and as it does indeed in supply chains. So I just wonder, is AI or data optimization something you would call upon in this particular journey?
Yes. So I did my first cycling tour in 1993, and exactly the same as you. You're using maps to do that event. And I've done many cycling tours since then. Now we have digital tools, so pretty much all the cyclists use a tool called Komoot. It's the market leader in terms of being able to plan and execute a race like this. It uses a lot of optimization. It uses AI. It uses machine learning. It actually looks at popularity routes. Where have other cyclists ridden before? What were the actual results? So it's actually using that machine learning to create the best possible route. So it's absolutely revolutionized how we do cycle races like this. It's invaluable, but it's not perfect. And actually, I'll go on to the next slide, and I'll show you why. So did it move on to the next slide? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
So what you can see on the left-hand side is this gravel track. This is actually the SH36. So this is a highway in Albania. So it doesn't look like a highway that you and I would think of as a highway. Now, the problem is that tools like Komoot don't know that the SH36 is this gravel road, and it was actually on a fixed parkour, so we had to ride this. It doesn't know that it's on this gravel road. It assumes that it makes the assumption that all highways are actually tarmac, because it's lacking that data, the specificity of data of all of the roads. So very often the tools like Komoot would send you on roads which were like this when you're going through the Balkans, as opposed to roads which are tarmac, which were maybe they were 1 kilometer longer, but they were on tarmac as opposed to on sandy, gravel, and really difficult roads. And we have exactly the same within the supply chain. Yes, we have fantastic tools like Kinaxis, like Rapid Response, which are able to use AI and machine learning in our demand.ai and supply.ai modules, but they don't know everything about the conditions that they're going to encounter. In real time, we're going to find that we have the equivalent of these gravel roads. And so there was an expression that we had with the cyclists called, is it a good Komoot decision or is it a bad Komoot decision? This brings me into the agility. Every time, so you're following the plan and the system tells me to go and take a left turn, and it gives me 500 meters notification that I need to take a left turn. I have 1 minute to decide, is that a good Komoot decision or a bad Komoot decision? If it takes me 2 minutes to evaluate that decision, so using the tools that I have available to me, that's a minute too late. I've got to make that decision within the next minute. And so what I did, and what actually most of the top riders do, is you have two systems open simultaneously. So this is like a digital twin. You've got your live navigation system, which is telling you this is where you navigate. And then I've got a separate screen where I can zoom out and I can actually make an assessment to say, okay, the tarmac that I'm riding on looks pretty good. I can see it's telling me to go and take this left turn. It's taking me off the main road for a couple of kilometers and then back onto the same road again. So actually, I'm probably better off staying on this road rather than following this track where I don't know what the quality of the tarmac is going to be. So there I'm using a digital twin to actually make that decision. And I'm not using AI and optimization because I don't have enough time to use AI and optimization to make that decision. I'm actually using heuristics to make that decision, to say, to make the most agile decision that's possible. However, we talk about a trade-off between accuracy and agility. And I think that that's not necessarily the best way of thinking about it. When we're creating a plan, we want to create the best plan that we can make within the time frame that we've got to make that plan. Because if we make a really good quality plan, then we're going to have to make less of these tactical decisions about, do I want to go off and take the left-hand turn, or do I want to carry on going on the straight ahead? So it's a trade-off. And I would say that this actually goes into your sales and operations planning process. In your sales and operations planning process, which is typically a monthly process, you actually have the luxury of having quite a lot of time to make the best possible plan. And you want to make the best possible plan within reason, within that S&OP time horizon. But then when you come to execute that plan, you want to be really agile in the execution of the plan to make sure that as things change, or as the reality of the situation, you're assessing the reality of the situation versus your plan, you can make that decision. It really helps you to, you've got to have that agility, but the better the plan that you've made, the less of those tactical decisions you're going to make. So there is real value in focusing on creating a really good plan, but you also need to be really agile to respond to the changes when you see a gravel track like this.
Sure.
And the other picture there is just to show you that I did do it, that I did get to that's me at the end in Greece, and
looking in good shape there.
Looking in good shape.
So we received a question, Matt, from Christoph, and it's a good question. Whilst we're on the subject of technology, he wonders whether the analogy that we're talking about here between your challenge and the challenges of the supply chain can be applied to technology. So, for example, he's saying, a race such as this requires a specific bike that might not be the one you ride for the usual bike races. And he's wondering, is this the same with IT technology, which could, should that be adapted to sort of suit the specific supply chain that's required for that industry?
So I promise you that I didn't tee up Christoph to ask that question, but actually that actually brings me perfectly onto the another slide that I've got there, which I think does. So I was looking at the equipment that I would need to use, and the way that I considered the equipment, the bike that I would need to use, and everything that I would need to take with me, was actually about risk. That's the way that I thought about it. I was looking at the bike had to be able to deal with gravel conditions, with multiple different conditions, but it also needed to be fast on the road. So I was looking at what was the correct risk profile that I needed to have on my bike. By choosing road tires, for example, I knew that I would be compromising the performance on the gravel, but I also knew how far I would be cycling on the road. So it was, so looking at a typical risk framework. And then all of the equipment that I brought, I was looking at the risk in terms of what was the likelihood of an event happening, and what would the impact of that event be? A totally standard risk management framework. But I also added an extra dimension in there, which is, what was the cost of the mitigation strategy? So an example of that would be the chance of breaking a spoke is reasonably high, although I didn't break a spoke. And the cost of that would be, I would say, medium, because breaking a spoke doesn't stop the bike, but it compromises the performance of the bike. However, taking a spare spoke and taking all of the equipment that I would need to do to change the spoke, so I could have mitigated that risk. but the mitigation would have actually meant a lot of additional weight that I was carrying on my bike. So I decided that actually that risk I wasn't going to try and mitigate, because the cost of the mitigation was too high. Whereas, say, another component, I could mitigate that risk by carrying something very, very small, a derailleur hanger, for example, that's very light, and so that mitigation strategy doesn't have a very big cost that's associated with that. Now, why is that important? Well, that was important on the race because I managed to create a bike that, with all of my equipment, without my bottles, weighed about 16 kilos. Whereas other riders, their bikes weighed 28. One person I was speaking to, his bike weighed 28 kilos. And that has a huge compromise on the performance of the bike because he tried to mitigate too many risks. And it's exactly the same, I think, in the supply chain. If we try and mitigate all of the risks, we know that a lot of organizations put a lot of inventory into their supply chain to mitigate every single risk in their supply chain by putting in place, tons and tons of inventory at all of their nodes in the supply chain. The cost of that mitigation strategy was tremendous. And what we've seen is a lot of organizations, as we've gone into recession, we've had the inflation, have actually having major cash flow issues because they've got too much inventory in place. So I think what we have to consider is not just what risk do we mitigate, but what is the cost of that mitigation strategy? And then have a deliberate choice about what do we mitigate and how do we mitigate those type of issues.
So if you don't mind me asking you maybe to park your bike for a little while.
Absolutely.
Which sort of moves us more sort of on towards the supply chain focus itself. Now, I understand that Kinaxis, you're transitioning from an organization that's effectively supply chain planning organization to one that's more supply chain management. Can you just sort of explain the difference between those terms and what does it mean to Kinaxis and its customers, please?
Yeah, so I think that this is really important. We created the disciplines of supply chain execution and supply chain planning, in probably over the last 40 years or so. And I think largely that was because they were done by different functions within the organization. So we had a planning function, we had a manufacturing function, we had a logistics function, and they were often responsible for the execution of the supply chain, and we had a planning function which was responsible for the planning of the organization. And tools that were available, in fact, we didn't have tools that were available that could cope with the amount of data that you would actually be able to consider planning and execution together. So we actually had planning tools, and then we had WMS and TMS and OMS tools, which were much more focused on the execution. But the reality is that we created silos, and planning and execution are very often go hand in hand, and they're not necessarily done sequentially. We don't necessarily plan the supply chain and then execute the supply chain. We plan and execute almost in parallel. So sometimes things are changing in execution, which means that we actually have to replan the supply chain. So execution and supply chain need to happen concurrently. And we realized that with now the power, the additional computing power, with AI, with AI and better optimization, we were able to concurrently plan and concurrently execute the supply chain. And that's the direction that we've been taking within Kinaxis. So the way that we really describe it's the orchestration of people, physical, digital, and financial assets to meet customer expectations and corporate goals while preserving the planet. And actually, preserving the planet is also another really important feature to what we call supply chain management. So, we don't refer to supply chain management and supply chain execution and supply chain planning. We're actually really talking about orchestration, and that's what I think it's, that's the direction that we're heading in. We're certainly not talking about all aspects of execution. It's really those orchestration aspects of planning and execution where Kinaxis is focusing.
So the benefit to the customer effectively then would be visibility of their carbon footprint, for example.
Yes. So visibility of the carbon footprint is becoming increasingly important, particularly in Europe. So if you look at the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which comes into force from 2025, it's actually based on 2024 numbers. Companies in Europe, including those who are based elsewhere, will be required to report indirect emissions, so their scope 3 emissions, across their supply chains. So that's coming up now. From a financial perspective, this actually is the CFO, I'm sure, is really worried about the planet at a personal level. But from their role, what they're worried about is the risk to the business. And the risk to the business is that they have a legislative requirement to start reporting scope 3 emissions in 2024 and starting from 2025, that will be audited, and those will be increasingly rolled out between 2025 and 2029. So Kinaxis has just launched, actually at our conference last month, we launched a new sustainability module. And I'll just share my screen again.
This was at your Connections event in Nashville. This was
at Connections event. So let me just go on to the next screen. And this is just a screenshot of our sustainability model. So we're focusing just on scope 3 emissions, and we're focusing on 5 different categories across those scope 3 emissions. And it allows an organization to look at their CO2e emissions by product group. So you've got in the example there raw, packaged, intermediate, finished goods, and also to see the geographical location of where those scope 3 emissions are coming from. And so this is a product which has just launched. Now, I know that that this is very early days. Sorry, I'm just going to. I have stopped sharing, haven't I?
You have indeed, yes.
Yeah,
we're talking about some of the other, maybe some of the other. We can talk again. Some of the other technologies at Nashville.
This is extremely early days that we've started doing this, but we've partnered with a company called Klimatic, who is a German-based company, who are providing APIs for organizations to start monitoring and measuring their scope 3 emissions. And we combining that with the planning information that our customers are putting into rapid response in order to create these estimations of their carbon footprint. The more that we have organizations doing it, the greater the adoption, the better quality of data that we're actually going to start seeing based on these scope 3 emissions. And so what this allows organizations to do is actually to start proactively planning and making conscious decisions about how does their plan impact those scope 3 emissions, to incorporate these type of decisions into their S&OP process, for example. So this actually going forward becomes a really powerful and really important capability for organizations to actively manage their CO2 emissions. And we're not just stopping, and we're starting off with partnering with Klimatic, but we are looking to partner with other organizations, or we're working on it with Exeger, Everstream Analytics, Lever Data, 4Kites, for example, in order to improve the quality of the data. We will be looking at expanding beyond just CO2, looking at plastics, for example, which are really important within the consumer products industry, looking at water consumption. So this is very much the starting point, but actually I think that this is going to be an important element to planning going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think another issue that seems to crop up quite a lot. Certainly, you know, I'm seeing this during my travels, and you know, from talking to readers, etc. There isn't always that great confidence in carbon measurement. So, do you have a sort of a quick fix for that? Or I guess nothing's a quick fix, but do you have a way you can assure customers that some of the measurements that you're putting into the equation are indeed solid?
Yeah, and you know, and I think that's really important. That's a good challenge, and that's where our partnership with organisations like Klimatic, who have been set up by industry around experts, professors, academics, industry leaders who are experts in CO2 emissions, who are experts in utilizing the AI and machine learning and the data in order to provide these estimates of CO2 emissions. And these organizations will become better and better, and the accuracy of the data will become better and better with the adoption. So, in 2 years, when all European, or actually 50,000 European companies are going to have to start reporting their CO2 emissions, we're going to start having a much better data set, which will allow this data to improve. So, yes, we know it's not perfect today, but it's good enough to make a start on it. It's directionally correct, and it will become more and more accurate as we go forward. And as it's legislated upon, and as it's audited, and that going forward, all of this information will be audited. There will be expert auditors who will be looking at all of this data. We're going to start seeing better and better quality data.
And I think also on the topic of auditing, it kind of moves us forward onto our next question I had for you, which is around the Gartner Magic Quadrant. It looks like Kinaxis is rated pretty highly again on this measure. Can you just talk me quickly through what the accreditation means for Kinaxis and what, in fact, the implications of that for your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just get it. So the Gartner Magic Quadrant is really important to Kinaxis, and within Kinaxis that we are incredibly proud that we've been categorized as a leader for the 9th successive year. So that's our ability to execute and the completeness of our vision. Now, why that's important is that it's about credibility within the market. So Gartner's an independent organization. It evaluates all of the planning vendors, and because with this consistency that Kinaxis has had within the Magic Quadrant, it gives our customers confidence that we have our vision is as good as the vision of any of our competitors, that our ability to execute is as good or better than all of our competitors. So it's about giving that reassurance, that quality stand, or the stamp of a quality approval from Gartner, that we actually have a really good solution. This year was actually we were rated better than we've ever been rated in the past. We were top in both the completeness of vision and in our ability to execute. And we were the top vendor. We scored the top scores in 4 out of the 5 use cases, and in 7 out of the 15 critical capabilities, Kinaxis was the top vendor. And one we were most proud about is that we were #1 in user experience, and that's an area where we've not been so strong in the past. So it actually shows that when you start looking at the detail of the Magic Quadrant, that we're not just staying the same in that leaders quadrant, that we're actually improving, that we're focusing on some of the areas that we've been weaker. and improving on those areas as well. So the Magic Quadrant is, and Gartner's rating is incredibly important to Kinaxis, and we're incredibly proud of our performance over the past 9 years.
I think this could be an opportunity as we're reaching towards the end of our webinar to bring you back onto the subject of cycling. Let's see how this question goes from the audience. It's from David. He's asking about resilience in today's world of supply chain management. How important is it to build resilience into the supply chain?
So I really like this question. This is something that I've been thinking about. Now, there's been a bit of a buzzword going around in supply chain, which is this term called anti-fragility, which is almost beyond resilience. And anti-fragility is resilience is the ability to bounce back following a disruption to the same level. Anti-fragility is actually the ability to bounce back stronger or to become stronger in the face of a disruption. And I've been a bit, well, what does this really mean? And being a little bit cynical about this. And so I'll tell you a story. So I mentioned earlier that I broke my rear derailleur on this mountain it was at 10 o'clock at night. And I got off the mountain at 2 o'clock in the morning, wondering, thinking that my race was over, at that point, having had an absolutely brilliant race. I managed to resolve that problem. As I said, I got to the bike shop, and I then managed to cycle back to where I left off. And I was incredibly motivated. At that point, I was so motivated to continue. And I was thinking, why am I feeling so motivated? I'm actually lost a day, and I'm now riding up a 2,000-meter mountain in addition to what I would normally have to ride, because I had to ride back to the point where it broke. And what I realized is that resilience or anti-fragility are not just physical capabilities. It's also a mental capability, and it's a mental capability for the organization as well. It's when you overcome some of those really big challenges as an organization, how you get together and actually are now feeling so motivated that you can overcome any of the challenges. And that, I think, is an important aspect to resilience that we overlook. We think resilience is about putting in place 2 factories where we might have had 1 factory in the past. Yeah, that's true, and that's maybe resilience. When you look at my kit list, I was trying to put resilience into my cycling race by taking the right equipment. But there's this really big mental aspect to resilience as well. And actually, I think what we need to do a lot more as organizations is identify how do we leverage that mental aspect of resilience. And that was one of the big light bulb moments for me about this anti-fragility, is thinking, actually, it's not a physical capability. It's actually a mental capability within organizations. It's the ability to bounce back stronger. I hope that answered your question.
Well, it certainly answered David's question. And I think you also anticipated the next question pretty well as well. It's our friend Christoph again saying, what are the sort of mindset similarities required between your sort of ultra cycling and the supply chain? But I think you pretty well answered that in that previous question. It's that, openness and determination.
There's another, yes, there is that determination, but there's actually another aspect to the mindset, which is, So people say to me, well, how do you deal with 40 plus degrees temperature? How do you have the resilience to deal with that? And the way that I deal with that when I'm cycling is that the best way that I can describe it is that I have I put a box around the pain within my head, and I have another box which is focusing on executing my race, riding, thinking about my next food stop. And I actually have another box which is thinking about lots of other thoughts, about thought leadership. I wasn't listening to music. But I think it's the ability to ring fence these different aspects, be able to ring fence the pain and not let it overwhelm me, because I think that's where a lot of people get overwhelmed by the pain. And it's the same within the supply chain. I think supply chains and people within the supply chain get overwhelmed by the disruption, whereas actually you need to put that disruption in a box. It's still there, but not let it overwhelm the supply chain. And I think that's really important for this resilient mindset.
Matt, I noticed the clock is ticking towards the 45-minute mark, which is kind of where we promised people we would draw a line under this. Forgive me as a helicopter passes overhead. Perils of living next to a hospital. I wanted to say that when I interviewed you earlier this year for the magazine, we kind of ran out of time then as well. We ran out of space. So I always feel like we've got unanswered questions here. Just very quickly at the end, I just want to ask you, your job title, industry thought leader, kind of leaves you open to this question from me. So I do apologize in advance, but where do you think we're going in this industry in the next few years, next few months even? I'd be very interested to hear your thought about sort of, I know you're not a futurologist, but you're the next best thing in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think this is an incredibly exciting time to be within this supply chain space. I think we're moving out of the age of Excel, and we're now moving really into the age of digital tools. And what these digital tools enable organizations to do is to put in place new processes, and the tools are actually enable these new processes and new techniques. And I think that this is going to be, and we have, part of these tools, we have, of course, AI and machine learning, we have, digital twins, we have, scenario planning, we have all of these capabilities which are coming along. Supply chain is becoming so important. I think over the last 3 years, organizations have realized how important supply chain is. Supply chain is not just about cost minimization. Now supply chains are actually really critical for delivering top line benefits as well. And so the importance of the supply chain, the new tools that we see coming in, I actually think make this a really exciting time to be in the supply chain space.
Yes, I share that excitement with you, Matt. Listen, as always, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you and hearing your insights today. Thank you very much indeed. But sadly, we are running out of time. So just sort of leaves me to say again, thank you very much for your fabulous contribution today, and also to our viewers for joining us and providing some valuable and interesting questions. So I just want to say on behalf of Logistics Business and Kinaxis, thank you from me, Peter MacLeod, for joining us today. And until next time, goodbye and have a great rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.